The Brahmin settlements appeared in 1978. Another important publication of yours of the same year was on the Bhakti movement in South India. This was jointly authored with M.G.S. Narayanan. Until this paper appeared, I think Bhakti was seen in two different ways. One as a longing for God, as a very personal, an individual's personal longing for God, or as a rebellion against the orthodoxy, against the establishment. But you argued that the Tamil Bhakti movement was actually a state-sponsored project. What prompted you to think differently?
Now, I wouldn't quite say that these are the only two ways in which Bhakti was looked at before that. To begin with, and in fact, the label Bhakti movement was given to the study of the literary phenomenon that was associated with Bhakti, the Alvar, Nayanar literature that had grown around this. It was later that the religious content of it was appreciated, the religious, philosophical aspect of it. Still later, when scholars like Nilakanta Shastri and Varadachari started writing about it, they saw the social aspect of it, particularly the anti-caste, reformist aspect of this. But when we, that is M.G.S. Narayanan and I, looked at it, we saw that it went beyond that. Now, first of all, we saw that it was not actually a protest against caste. It was more a conformism than protest that we saw it. This conformism, we realized, was because of, I wouldn't quite call it a sponsorship, but it was because of the heavy political content there. We saw that the Bhakti movement in South India at that time was some kind of a reflection, some kind of a legitimation of the existing, emerging social and political order. For this, we will have to understand also the fact that the Bhakti in South India at that time is invariably associated with the institution of temple. Shiva and Vishnu are there, but not Shiva and Vishnu who reside in Kailasa or Vaikuntha. Shiva who is in Tiruvarur, Shiva who is in Chidambaram, or Vishnu who is in Srirangam. So it's not Vishnu in the absolute or Shiva in the absolute, but Shiva or Vishnu as consecrated in individual temples. And temples, as I was saying earlier, were huge landed magnates by then. So around the time of the Bhakti movement, that is 7th century, 8th century, this was the time when the temple-centered agrarian corporations were emerging as huge landed magnates. The population of South India was getting transformed into peasants subservient to the institution of temple and the Brahmanical groups who were controlling the temple. So getting their allegiance to the temple meant getting allegiance to the upper sections of society at that time. So the Bhakti movement, in fact, one of the byproducts of that project that we had taken together was a paper that I published, the temple base of the Bhakti movement. So temple was the institutional base of the Bhakti movement, and temple as an institution, as a landed magnate, as a money lender, it was this. And temple was seen also as a node of power which was made use of by the state. So in that respect, state had a role to play in this. So you can see the Chola ruler Kochanganan, or the Pandyan ruler Nadumaran, or the two Chera rulers Kulasekhara Alvar and Cheraman Perumal Nayanar being leaders of the Bhakti movement. So it is in this way that we see it. I do not know if we were conscious, at least I cannot say about myself, I wasn't conscious about this, but now looking back, this is the advantage that you have when you have hindsight. When looking back, I realized that we were writing this in the immediate post-emergency period. Emergency had come to an end in 1977 with Mrs. Gandhi losing heavily, the Janata Party coming to power. One of the major ingredients of Janata Party was Bharatiya Janasangh, the earlier incarnation of BJP, Bharatiya Janasangh, with Advani and Vajpayee as ministers in that. when Jansangh was a major constituent of that, there was this very, very heavy attempt to use religion for political gains. So religion as a means of achieving political gains was happening in front of my eyes. I may have been influenced by this. I will not be able to say for sure, but I don't rule out the possibility of my being influenced by this reality that was happening around us. What with all the controversy about textbooks, the Arya Samaj and RSS demanding the ban of textbooks written by Romila Thapar, Bipan Chandra, R. Sharma, etc. The slogan that was being shouted in Delhi University by students, R. S. Sharma Hatao, Hindu Dharma Bachao. So that kind of slogan that was going on. Perhaps religion as a major tool of gaining power and remaining in power was what I was witnessing in front of me. Perhaps I must have been influenced by that also in our understanding of the Bhakti movement. Certainly I remember I had written another paper, Kulasekhara Alwar, socio-political background of Kulasekhara Alwar and his Bhakti. There I had used this for Romila Thapar's analysis of Ashoka and his use of Buddhism as a matter of policy, Dhamma as a policy. I was very, very heavily influenced by that in my analysis of Kulasekhara Alwar's policy of Bhakti. So perhaps these were the factors behind my understanding of Bhakti as a political tool, the temple as a political institution, etc., which I had developed later also in my dissertation.
Would your understanding of Bhakti have been different were you writing today? Had this project happened in more recent times, in the last 5-6 years, would you look at it in a very different way?
Now, of course, as I was saying earlier, there is no point in being counterfactual, but still, I don't think there would be a very, very major. Now, because I remain where I was, I haven't changed my position. Perhaps some of the adjectives that I have used there, for example, when I said this was a reflection and a legitimation of the emerging social political order, but I had described that as the emerging feudal order. Perhaps that adjective I may not use with so much confidence today, because the confidence I used to have about society being feudal, that confidence I have lost. Otherwise, the frame of analysis would be the same.
Your doctoral work was on the political structure of early medieval South India. So when you began work in the late 70s, there was a dominant paradigm, the one represented by the works of Nilakanta Shastri, C. Meenakshi, T.V. Mahalingam, what we now call the nationalist historiography. But this model was already being called into question by a number of historians, each in their own different ways. Karashima or Subbarayulu, George Spencer, Kenneth Hall, who else? Burton Stein, maybe even Arjuna Padurai, Worship and Conflict. How do you make sense of this shift, and do you think your work resonated with this shift?
No, there I will have to be a little autobiographical, naturally, since the question is autobiographical. I began my work in the second half of the 70s, 1977 I got registration, and by about 80 I had nearly completed writing the first draft. But unfortunately I couldn't continue it. Now, because of various reasons. One is I shifted my job from Kerala to Bangalore. Here was the responsibility of building up a new department, a new university. Then I had domestic problems, so I had to go home every week. Both my parents were ill, and I also had a bout of illness myself. So the first draft I had completed by the end of 80. I had to leave. I couldn't do anything until about 85, 86. And when I took the first draft to finish it, I realized that this had been completely outdated with the publication of the writings of Karashima, Subbarayulu, Burton Stein. Not so much Spencer and Hall, but these were the three major names. I realized that what I had written in the first draft was largely a critique of Nilakanta Shastri and his disciples like Appadurai, that is the senior Appadurai, Angadipuram Appadurai, not Arjun, Appadurai or Meenakshi or Mahalingam. That was, no, I had actually designed it as a critique of Mahalingam's South Indian polity, because we were dealing with the same thing. But I realized that there is no point in now criticizing and rejecting Mahalingam. Now I had to reckon with the writings of Karashima, which came out in the early 80s. I had to reckon with the writings of Stein, which came out again in the 80s. And when I read it in fact I should say that I did it all over again. When I read it, I saw that I could do a better job in writing this. Now I was able to see, for example, that there is a yawning gap between the image of royalty that was presented in the royalist literature, including the Prashastis, court chronicles, etc. on the one side, and the political structure that was represented by other kinds of documents, that is land grants, proceedings of local groups like Nadu, Brahmadeya, Sabha, etc. So how can one make sense of this gap? This was one question that I asked myself, which to my knowledge Stein or Subbarayalu haven't asked. In trying to answer this question, I went closely into the secondary literature and I saw that Nilakanta Shastri's description of Byzantine royalty that you were talking about earlier, that was derived largely from the Prashasti part of it, without paying any attention to the reality that is represented in the documents of the village committees, the Nadu, the Brahmin settlements, the trading corporations and others. Then I saw that in order to make sense of this, we will have to go to the local groups better. And it was here that I was able to see that it evolves from below. That is the peasant settlements, the groupings of the peasant settlements into larger units like Nadus, then the trading corporations like Nagarams, the Brahmanical settlements called Brahmadeyas with their Sabha, etc. These were the actual units of political organization, the building blocks there, which get integrated with the role of the monarchical state. So the monarchical state was a very weakly organized polity, and in order to legitimize this weakly organized polity, all this rhetoric in the inscriptions, the Prashastis, the court literature, etc. was necessary. This is how I was trying to make sense of this, and I found that Karashima's explanation was meaningful. The details that Subbarayalu had provided in his political geography, this was useful, and the rejection by Bertenstein of Nilakanta Shastri, particularly the exposure of the contradictions in Nilakanta Shastri's, that was also handy to me. Now that is the way in which I resonated. I did not at least I don't think that I was directly influenced by any of these writings. Now, because I was trying to chart my own course, of course, being indebted to Sharma's model of Indian feudalism more than Nilakanta Shastri's idea of a centralized monarchy or Bertenstein's idea of a segmentary state. I was more influenced by Sharma's understanding of Indian feudalism, and that was what I was doing.
Did the contemporary state, the state that was there in front of you, did that influence you in any significant ways in your approach to state? Because the Indian state, the character of the Indian state was undergoing a rapid transformation in the 70s. It was becoming increasingly authoritarian. So did that in some sense influence your approach to the idea of state itself?
Perhaps yes. Now I have written it also. Now when Professor Champakalakshmi and I together edited a volume on state and society in pre-modern South India, in the introduction which I wrote, in the introduction I have said this, because the 70s was a period when the state in India was undergoing a major transformation. Now, after the Bangladesh war, before emergency, the state was going to closer towards authoritarianism, and the experience that the European fascist states had gone through in the pre-war period, that was perhaps happening in India. This is the feeling that we had. And it is precisely during this period that some of the major studies about the origin of the state in India was coming out. For example, Thappar's work on From Lineage to State comes out in 1980. 1980. Thappar's work on this lineage to state. Then Sharma's work on material culture and social formation, where he did not directly address the question of state formation, which he reserved for a later book. All these were coming up. Now you can make a comparison between Sharma's understanding of the evolution of state, emergence of state on the one side, and his earlier 1958 book, Political Theories and Political Ideas and Institutions in Ancient India, where the question of the formation of the state is not addressed. So the formation of the state becomes a central concern towards the end of the 70s and early 80s. And I must believe that I too was worried about the direction that the institutional state in the country was taking. So perhaps my study of the nature of the state and the way in which the state was evolving in South India was directly influenced by what was happening around us, particularly because since I was younger by 30 years at that time, perhaps I was more worried about state, more concerned with what was happening.
You have recorded, you acknowledge your debt to Sharma's feudalism model, and you have described the state in early medieval South India as feudal. But there is a significant difference. Sharma's understanding of feudalism is that there was a centralized state, relatively extensive, and this fragmented into a number of regional polities in the post-Gupta period. But your description of feudalism in South India is different, because the emergence of the state itself is identified as feudal in character. So this feudal state appears in a place, in a region where there were no states to begin with, but only a number of competing chieftaincies. So that I think is a very interesting difference, because the Sharma's ideas of fragmentation itself has been widely contested. So what do you think the model that you are trying to present has? What ramifications does this model have for understanding the evolution of state as an institution?
This is, as I was saying earlier, when I was able to look at the local groups, the peasant settlements, Ur, Velanvage villages, and their groupings into Nadu, etc., I was able to see the building blocks in the emergence of states in these. And what you have is the integration of these groups into a single whole by the time, for example, the Chola state or the Chera state in the context of the Chera state in the context of Kerala, or the Pallava state in the context of northern Tamil Nadu, when these were coming up. Sharma's, I have always felt, was some kind of a mechanical application of the Marxist scheme, where when the Roman Empire fell, the centralized Roman Empire gave way in the post-Carolingian period into a large number of fractured political units in the feudal states of the High Middle Ages. So it is a replication of that experience, that European experience, that you find in the understanding of Sharma, what we were saying earlier, trying to understand things in familiar categories. That is what we can see in the writings of Sharma. In the context of South India, the specificities obtaining in South India, in the context of Kerala or in the context of Tamil Nadu, where there is no antecedent of a state, trying to make sense of that, but then the forces, the feudal forces, feudal tendencies that Sharma saw in the context of post-Gupta India, they were visible also. So on the one side, you have clearly identifiable feudal tendencies, but without the experience of a pre-feudal classical slave-owning society or a centralized empire. So I was trying to make sense of this in my writing.
You just mentioned that you are not confident anymore of feudal as an adjective. Why do you think so?
That is because when you grow, you graduate, and many of the certainties that I had those days have graduated into probabilities.